Hi, this is Erik Kleinsmith, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
I love these episodes. I mean, we get to, so if everybody doesn't know, I always say this, but because it's cool to say, over 20 years ago, Erik Kleinsmith was my commander. When I was a spy in the Army, he commanded Delta Company. Yeah, I know, it's 25. He's really got to transition that to 25. He commanded Delta Company 165th MI Battalion, the Delta Rocks Company. And we deployed to Bosnia together. He joined us in Bosnia. We were already deployed at that point, and so his job was to manage a bunch of interrogators and interpreters and counterintelligence people running freely across the battlefield and try to figure out what the heck to do with us. He had 15 or 16 teams? Is that right?
We had 16 teams, and then we absorbed. First Armored Division had a team that was. They had a single team that was quote unquote out there flapping. So they were out there on their own causing all kinds of problems. So they rolled them into us partway through the year just to give them some parental guidance.
Now, look, I mean, you have 16 teams. They're not all going to perform at the same level. How many teams would you say were useful in the field of the 17 or 16 teams that you had?
Honestly, the deciding factor was not the team itself, but where they were and who they were supporting. So, we had a team out at the Norwegian Polish Polish brigade. Then we sent one team, Chief McDermott, and I think I can't remember who the NCOs were. Went with him, but we sent him down to the Polish brigade headquarters, and they had those guys were doing great. They had lots of leeway, but then you had a team, up at, I think you were up at Camp Angela or one of the northern ones, and whatever brigade headquarters that were there, they wanted you guys just to run copy and do guard post detail, and they didn't want you going off post, that kind of thing. So that's it really depended on who allowed what local commander allowed their team to operate more freely in their area.
Yeah, we were fortunate that we did a good job initially, made a great first impression with our commander. And he pretty much let us do whatever we wanted, and we just, as long as we gave them intel, that was what they what they wanted. Why are American units so bad at letting counterintelligence human collectors go out and do their damn job? Why are they so restrictive? Why do they not want to allow incentive use and all these other things that we're supposed to be able to do? Why do they want to hem us up? They know better. They have a two. They know better.
Right. Well, the part of the problem is we lost our ability to understand risks and to measure risks across the board. And so, and I hate to say it, but the Balkans was one of the worst examples of the bunker mentality and the criteria for the commander, for peacekeeping operations. Once you've maintained peace, the only measure of success for a commander is, did you bring everybody out that you brought in? Did you take, and to do that, you had to take zero risk. And so getting off the base camp was a monumental effort. You went through the process. I mean, how many times we had to get approvals just to do a simple mission. I mean, we even had an identified threat that was commuting in and out of Tuzla using the rail system. And so we wanted to get a team on the train. We could not get anybody within our leadership to let two of our guys get in plain clothes, get on the train, just ride it from one city to the next, because if something had happened on the train, there was no way they were talking about planning of, well, we should have a helicopter hover over it the entire way. So in case something happens, a team can jump out and extract these guys. It's like, they're just going through the morning commute with the rest of the Bosniaks, for an hour ride. It's you can't let these guys go for that. That was the amount of aversion to risk that we had. So that's honestly what I feel followed us into Iraq and Afghanistan as well. Once the combat operations had stopped, the bunker mentality set back in, and nobody wanted to leave the base camp. Well, then the whole country starts going to hell. And then that bunker mentality gets even more, it gets even more reinforced that, there's no way we're going out and doing these routes because there's IEDs along the roads or whatever. We're not letting anybody out for anything. And that's until we could break that mentality. I hate to say it wasn't until 2006. I think it was with Petraeus or whoever was the new architect of this is how we're going to do the surge in Iraq. They had to break that mentality first. And that's still when your career is based upon, how many losses of soldiers you took, not did you succeed in the mission, that's the problem.
When you're afraid to go out, and this is the counterintelligence guy me talking. When you're afraid to go out and operate, you become the operation. I always would encourage like young collectors who is running who, and if you're not going out, you're being run by whoever shows up to do whatever. Right. And also, where's the counter surveillance of the surveillance that's clearly happening because we never went out? So the surveillance comes right up to the gate, tries to penetrate the camp all the time. Who's countering
that? Was a problem. Is we had somebody had caught, it was one of the northern base camps, it might even been yours, had caught a Japanese tourist taking photos of the U.S. of the front gate. And so they went out there, detained him, they brought it in. We had one Japanese linguist in our entire country who could interrogate this guy. You know who it was? It was Chaz Owen, the first sergeant. But we could not get a convoy put together to get him up there to question this guy. And so what the local unit did, they used some armor or infantry lieutenant who was Japanese descent. And he started his own untrained interrogation of these guys. And by the time somebody with authority got in there, they had stripped this guy naked. He was hogtied. I mean, it was just every bad interrogation you've seen from the movies they had done to this poor tourist who just happened to be taking some photos. And it was just, that risk, the aversion to risk just to send a guy in a convoy up there to talk to this guy, that became a huge fiasco. So
I always complain about our level of training. I saw John Murray a couple of weeks ago. He's another counterintelligence agent, someone I respect. And I just said, like, I was in E4 before, when we deployed, so I don't know, but it seemed like they didn't train us to do our job. Like I literally had no idea. Yes, I knew my job was to talk to people, that kind of thing, but no training. And then I think about an armor unit or some cav unit. They have no idea. Like they have less than no idea. They have the wrong idea. At least I knew like I could get in trouble for doing this stuff wrong. Yeah. What basic skills would you want? Like if you were going to be a colonel of a battalion with, CI asset or a human asset, what basic skills would you want to give your guys before they deploy? What would be important to you?
For any kind of soft, I guess we call it chaos, the civil humanitarian assistance, was it operational support teams, anybody that wasn't a bullet thrower or somebody who was doing combat arms, they were responsible and operating in very independent teams by themselves to do that kind of work. I mean, there are certain, obviously, you take great precautions and protections when you send folks out there like that, but you have to give these guys a broad set of intent. They have to be wired into the intent of the mission, and then let them open up to operate within that intent. It's just simple doctrine, but when it gets to practice, like why did we not do this? So I actually saw some of the training that took place before the initial units went into Bosnia on the peacekeeping mission, and it was, some of it was trying to like a crash course on, how do we deal with checkpoints? How do we deal with non-combat operations? But a lot of it was, they called it validation. And no unit could go unless they were validated by somebody up the chain, so that it was almost like we're doing this for our own professional liability. It's, this guy screwed up and he shot a round into the barrel. Well, wasn't he validated before he went to go not to do that? Yeah. Well, then that's his fault, not the commander's fault. And that's, it seemed to us, and I was in a different unit at the time, but we were doing observer control or supporting that training, and it was a lot of CYA that was going on. It's just, and unfortunately, that's when you've got a peacetime army that's gotten, that has had slowed down in terms of their outlook or lost focus on what the actual threat is. You're going to run into that. I mean, we're constantly facing that today.
Yeah. One of the things that I've always thought about too is we had a medal, a mission essential task list. This is for the audience, and it's like these are the things that you need to be able to master to be a proficient unit. And there were just a zillion things. Like these things couldn't all be essential because you can't do all of them because you have to operate, you have to provision, you have to do all these things. And then how do you go outside the wire and do this? And
Right.
More things that we can handle. And then, like you said, you had all of the validation training, which was how to convoy, how to do some basic first aid. And a lot of this stuff we knew, so it was good to brush up on it.
Yeah.
But when you pile all of that training together, it's a mountain that's bigger than the time that you've got to train on it,
Well,
didn't focus on the day-to-day stuff.
And that's how, how do you set your priorities? And I remember just saying to one commander of mine who he was continually stacking up more things and more things and more things. And, you could rightfully call him a workaholic, but I finally said in a meeting, because he was looking at it, it's like, what, you're looking at you're looking at me like you don't agree. And I finally just said, instead of doing 12 things half-assed, why don't we just prioritize the 6 things that you absolutely have to do right and do those? And man, was he mad.
Yeah.
But it had to be said. He told me he respected me for saying it later, but boy, he was really pissed.
The other thing I would want to encourage a commander to do is get a big ass so he can get chewed, and let his team chiefs know that, like, hey, if you're not being employed, I will take the ass chewing, get it figured out. I don't know what that exactly means, but it means if you're on guard duty, if you're burning poop, if you're doing all these other things that aren't your job, I've got top cover for you.
Right. There is a great leadership example from the Band of Brothers series during the last missions into Hagenau, Germany, where they had to go in at night. The regimental commander wanted a German POW to interrogate, but then really to parade around that his guys did that mission, and it was successful. They did lose somebody, but then the commander wanted them to do it again the following night, and the battalion executive, or the battalion commander, then was Dick Winters, basically said, we're just going to send in a report that says you guys didn't get anything, and get some sleep. We're pulling you off the line tomorrow. When I watched that, I so many things rang in my head of how I had to do similar situations where, and that's you have to take risks in leadership, where I had to prioritize things because I knew we could only do 6 of those 12 things. And so, and I had another commander who he would work himself to the bone, our headquarters commander. He'd work until 8 o'clock at night. He'd be exhausted. He was short. He was, short-tempered. It was incredibly frustrated all along. It was, you leave at 6 p.m. every day after a 12-hour day. He goes, how do you get all your stuff done? I looked at him. It's like, I don't. He goes, what do you mean? He goes, I know what's important. I know what's not important, and I'm willing to take the bumps on the things that I didn't get done because they're quite frankly not important. That's what it is.
Yeah, I learned to take naps in combat, and whenever anybody said anything, or I got the hint that someone was saying something, I would address it, because it's just one of those things. Like, this is how I'm a swing shift kind of guy, or a split shift kind of guy.
Yeah.
And I promise there will still be a war going on when I wake up in 90 minutes.
Right.
I promise.
Right.
I promise when I go to bed and everything else.
Yeah, and I keep telling the story to my friends about Chief Temby's bike, because one of the warrant officers that went down there brought his bicycle with him, shoved it in the Conex container so he could, bike around the countryside or whatever in a post-war torn, mine-ridden, landscape. But somehow, when we were packing up to leave, his bike was still there, and so we threw the bike in, back in the Conex container. We threw some netting over it to secure the whole thing. But when we had to had to get these things opened up for inspection, the entire company was formed up in front, and our commander saw that, and he was just livid at how bad, bad it looked with these random pieces of equipment, to include Chief Temby's bike in there. And he was just screaming at me face to face, top of his lungs, in front of 150 soldiers. And of course, you don't do anything. You don't say anything. You just say, yes, sir, and you march out. But I had 2 guys come up to me afterwards. It was Bart Dashko, and I think it was Sergeant Bearclaw. And they both came up and they said, teach me the ways, oh master. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, we were going to deck this guy. I said, we'd have been thrown out of the military. How is it that you didn't touch this guy? And why didn't you lose your temper? And it's like, losing your temper is not the point. That's, you can take any verbal abuse, but it's none of that, it's none of that is worth it. You don't violate your principles just because you're getting frustrated or angry. So and that's where they just said, please teach us how to keep our temper. So.
Yeah, well, and Bart talking to anybody was a fight, whether they knew it or not, because he was just such a combative conversationalist. I told my girlfriend, go ahead.
I had to pull him off of a base camp because he got P&G'd. He pissed everybody off on the camps. I was like, well, got to move the team. Is what for? Because they hate you now. So
yeah. I wanted to say this too about Top Cover. When I was in Iraq working in support of a whole bunch of CI teams and assets, we had made friends with the J2X, who was the senior commander over all of the human assets for the this is like the entire theater, right? And he had said, hey, if you guys ever need anything, let me know. And he was serious. He was an Australian officer under orders to not die. And so we kind of he had the right kind of attitude. And we were getting pushed around. We lived on a cluster of camps, and there was a hunk of red zone right between. It was a road that was not secured. And there had been bombs on it and everything else. And then so he's like, you guys have to go through the contractor gate. We're like, yeah, but we're not that kind of contractor. We're like, we work with the counterintelligence teams. We interview, and this guy knew all this stuff, but he had a hard on for contractors. And so they're like, so we have to go through the military gate with military vehicles. Great. So there was a 165th Humvee on the base camp we were on. It belonged to the MI asset. Like, had a bunch of MICEPs and stuff. We're like, hey, we're going to borrow this for a couple of days. And they're like, yeah, we don't care. We're not going anywhere with it. Yeah. And so we would take it across the camp, and it made this major mad at us for getting on the camp through the military gate. And he's like, you guys cannot go through the military gate, even with the military vehicle now. And so I stopped and I said, listen, you have to understand what we do and what's going to happen. If you force us to go through this gate, we're not going to come over here and support you until it's safe to do so. And then we're going to go higher, and understand our friends are all the way at the very top level, the J level. And you're going to have to deal with that, because we do have top cover here. Because I learned my lesson in Bosnia. Right. And he's like, yeah, well, do your best. And I'm like, I'm telling you right now, the next thing that's going to happen is I'm calling the J2X, and I'm going to ask him what we should do about this. And I promise you, he's going to do something about it. And the guy's like, yeah, whatever. And he blew it off. And so, you know what, the next thing I did, I went down and I gave that Australian officer an opportunity to get out of the Hoffa Palace for a day and a half. He's like, I've been dying to get out of here. You just gave me the best reason ever. And it was bad for that major on that camp. And then he's like, why did you guys do that to me? Like, we begged you, but we needed that top cover. Otherwise, we would have been mission incapable, because we wouldn't have gone across the street. We can't be in line with the Iraqi guys driving the water truck, the food. We can't be in line with those people. It's just not, it's not safe to do it. So anyhow, that's that top cover. Otherwise, we would have been non-op and couldn't go across the camp to support all the other teams over there, that's not a satisfactory answer when people outside the gate dying.
Right. Exactly. That's, again, you got to weigh those risks. That's the parts of it's different to be a manager than a leader, and that's the biggest piece. And I had a great boss who was a kind of a formal mentor, who said, if you're going to do something in the world of intelligence, you got to know your trade craft better than anybody. Yeah. You have to be a good manager. And for the life of me, I don't understand why intelligence as a career profession brings in folks who disregard leadership as an important piece. And that's, that was a very stark example, because the 165th, when I came to your unit, I had only been in combat units from that point on. And so for 8 years prior, I had only been in infantry or armor battalions or armor brigades. And, and I was the only intel guy in those units or just the extreme minority with just a small team of folks. As soon as I went to the intel unit, I was just an eye-opener shock of some of the games and some of the ridiculous things that were important. It's just like, this is not important. Why are we even doing this? One thing or another. So.
And I didn't realize that until about 20 years later, until I met enough guys in infantry units are like, what the hell kind of unit was that? And I'm like, that's how we did it. They're like, that is so stupid.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to close that part of the show out, because unless you want to say anything else, it is interesting though. And all these little stories, I think, add up to how challenging it is to do our job and how dangerous it is. Yeah. But then when we get it right, when we're able to, like one of the things I learned, it's a question for you. One of the things I learned from Bosnia was that my job to gather intel is not to gather all of the intel that's on the list of questions, because the questions are written in a vacuum somewhere else.
Right.
A lot of what we had to report back was, hey, there's nothing significant to report here, which isn't what you want to report. You want to report
Right.
other things. Like, here's how the mission is going across the entire array of things it could be. You know, if there's not danger, where are areas where the commander can flex in resources and everything. And so I learned that if I built a network that was powerful and I met and knew a lot of people, the information that was threat-based would flow into me. Everybody's looking for threat all the time. Ping, 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 pinging for threat. But then if you don't report back any other aspects of the mission, you can be absolutely failing to win as a commander, but you never hear about it because everybody, civil affairs, ag teams, whoever it is, they're always reporting how they're winning the war. And, you know, I'm writing an op-ed against what Secretary Gates said the other day about how we should stay in Afghanistan and spend some more aid money. Like, no, we don't get to do that anymore. Your plan did not work. You failed. I watched the ag teams. He talks about girls being in school. I went to those schools 2 days later when they weren't schools anymore, you know, and I talked to the Army units. You didn't know how many schools were in the area. These are the kind of things I focused on. And I would say 95% of what I focused on was that. Did I get threat-based intel? Of course. But I let that flow in through my network. And I let everybody else work because everybody else is working on that. But when I'm going to the commander with stuff that he can action on, and it doesn't have to be lethal, that's so much more powerful to that, especially when the level of threat is not what you think it is because you're only looking for threat. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes. Well, or you're only looking for a certain type of threat, you know, or you're only looking at certain areas. I mean, in the Balkans, the reason why we were, you know, fairly effective. We were the only game in town in terms of intelligence for a while. And there'd be reports that would come back down from the major 3-letter agencies about this is our intelligence summary of what's going on in the Balkans. And our team, you know, our operations team would get it. It's like, we wrote this. You know, this is just cyclical reporting. We're the only ones that are really doing any collection because, again, we're the only ones that were able to get off the base camp in less than 4 vehicles and actually go do the missions that we were able to do. Nobody else was able to even get, you know, the poor combat arms guys. God, they weren't doing anything. Our LURS company, their mission was to do a convoy every day, go down to the mass grave sites, make sure nobody disturbed it, and drive back. You know, and the high point of that entire mission, which took place over a month, so they got into an accident with guys from the 82nd Airborne, and they got into a fight on the road. And I had to do a 15-6 investigation to sort out who hit who. You know, that was the high point of that mission. So,
and they were tasked to kill cats on a camp or whatever too. Do you remember that when they were the extermination?
The dogs. No, gosh, we got to clear all these dogs off. So they just hand out 7 or 20 medic handles and tell these soldiers to just go beat them to death. I mean, that's just inhumane. That was, to me, again, that's poor leadership. That's insane. They should have coordinated with the vets. The vets could have been down there. You know, there's all kinds of different ways they could.
Well, and plenty of those units wanted those dogs. So we did. I was on a unit. We had vets, and they just inoculated the dogs, and they were a great first alert. Like, who's better than that? You know, especially in that area. But it's interesting the amount of intel you can collect that is not based on threat that gives you a much more realistic picture of what's going on. Let's talk about the messaging aspect of what we do and what you've done, because that's also interesting. Because again, the message is that we're winning internally. I come back and go, hey, you think you were winning with farming, but I can't find a farmer that's actually using these practices. So talk a little bit about how that works and with what we do.
Well, that goes into the entire problem that we're facing with the and the media is all over this with misinformation, disinformation, the fake news, you know, all that kind of things, all those kind of things that are coming up. My last tour in the Army was chief of intelligence for the Land Information Warfare Activity, and it's now called, the First Information Operations Group. And the key of that was we were the first people to really grasp what it meant to deceive somebody, what it meant to do psychological operations as a coherent combined effort. We'd already, the Army had been doing it for decades, doing different practices, especially during World War II. But it was the first unit that was solely dedicated to warfare in the information spectrum, not outside of combat arms. And it hit upon me the amount of things that we were working with, how to deal with lies. One of my bosses that I knew him as a contractor there, and then I ended up working for a short time. He's actually like the national chair at DIA for the understanding deception, foreign adversary deception, when you're being lied to. Great guy. I'm still in contact with him, and we had these systems down, but it was everything that was going on was just strictly within the DoD national security sphere. And now you're seeing it, deception and censorship and, these kind of information wars essentially going all throughout our society and culture. And that's really been, I guess, the scariest part is when I did that 20 years ago, I should have recognized that it was coming to everyone else.
One of the things we've seen most recently in the last couple of days is this narrative switch that the Republicans, and this is not a political conversation, it's just an example of the bald-faced lie, right? That the Republicans were behind the defund the police movement. I mean, this is patently, I already can't take Democrats seriously. I'm not a big fan of Republicans, but I can't take Democrats seriously because of things like this. We're like, you just said, not even a year ago, defund the police, and now you're. These are the kind of things where, because of tribal beliefs, we one side believes one, or the fact that we couldn't discuss a Wuhan lab outbreak, which a lot of us were like, until you can prove otherwise, that is a viable outcome. I'm not saying it happened that way, but I'm not going to trust. I don't trust us. Why would I trust the Chinese to get this right and not lie about it? Right. And now it turns out very likely.
And I've written about this, and I continue to write about this because there's so much to unpack here with censorship and how that goes. The first thing was as news organizations started introducing fact checkers, and you find immediately that the fact checkers are relatively they're biased themselves, and then they start introducing censors, and it's like and the thing is every time you put in something like that, another barrier for you to seek information or the truth, it's all you're doing is you're adding in another layer of bias. So even the censors were biased against the Wuhan lab theory. And, and I got stories about how it said that Facebook blocked 18 million posts or something like that about, that related to misinformation about the COVID virus. And then a week later, they lifted their censorship of the Wuhan lab theory. What was the deciding process that said we here in the halls of Facebook in the middle of California, we know better than everyone else that this is misinformation. Therefore, we're going to censor this story because it's misinformation. And that's the crux of what's the problem with censorship overall is. You on a daily basis, you're dealing with misinformation, whether it's just inaccurate stuff, inaccurate data, or malinformation, which is which you could call it spin, which is this. Well, they're actually telling the truth, but they're saying it in a way that makes the context of it untruthful. What censorship does, it's like the carpet bombing, solution to getting rid of misinformation. Right. And it destroys everything. It's like instead of using rational arguments, logical reasoning, we don't trust that the consumers of our information are smart enough to do that because we're so smart. We're the ones who are going to decide for them. Therefore, we're going to censor this. And that's even at the best end of censorship. The worst end of censorship is we know this is a lie. We want this lie to propagate, and we don't want any scrutiny of this lie, so we're going to censor to make sure that this, that our BS gets out there, and the other person doesn't even have room to argue against it. That's about the worst thing. Again, that's the more nefarious way of approaching that. I mean, and I always throw this question out when I do any kind of talk or discussion. If your goal is to get rid of all the misinformation in the world, how would you know when you achieve it?
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I mean, how would you know when you've done it? Well, we've done it. Everything can be trusted now. Yeah. No, it's impossible.
Yeah, so, it is impossible. And who gives someone the ability to be the perfect arbiter of information? You might do your best, but you're going to make mistakes. I mean, look, to me, an accurate intel picture, 60%. If someone claims to be more accurate than that while deployed, I think they're full of shit.
Yeah. I mean, there were some times that quite honestly, I was off. I made some reads that were wrong, but the best thing I could do is understand as quickly as possible when I was wrong, but then have the humility to change my mind instead of sticking to my story and saying this is the reason why this is happening. It has nothing to do with me. Intel folks are wrong a lot. That's just the way it goes. What you have to have though is the most important thing is, and that's why I say Intel is always for the customer. If there's customer doesn't believe in what you're saying, then you're worthless. Just like the news organization. I just saw it was like a Reuters Institute study that said the U.S. now ranks dead last in 46 countries for trust in the media.
They've earned it.
Well, and that's the thing is I look at that as there's a good part about that and there's a bad part about it. The bad part is like, God, I can't believe we're last. Really it throws shade on our media's ability or their decades old transformation from being some people who want to inform to people who want to persuade, or stories that are no longer stories to give you information but to give you a narrative. But then the good thing about that stat is not only is our media so horrible, but everybody in America knows it, and therefore we are going to be more skeptical on our reading of the news. We're going to more critically, if we just had blind trust, I think Iceland hit the top of it with like 64%. We're down in like the 30s or 20% of folks who trust the media. I think great. It should be zero. You should never trust the media, and you should always look at every single story with a grain of salt, with looking at a counter argument, because if they're going to give you narrative, then you're going to need to see the other side. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is an important point to point out. Like, if Iceland's at 60% and they're at the top of the list, they still, like, a lot of people don't trust their media.
Right.
I mean, not too late. And the other thing is like someone like David Muir, who's widely respected. This is not a knock on him, but when they're reporting on the storm last winter in Dallas, he talked about the refrigerator trucks coming for all the bodies they're going to have to store, and it was clearly done to create fear and capture a person, because ultimately they're selling ads for Cadillac and they're catering to an audience so they can sell. I mean, they're there to make money. I'm not saying that news should be state funded, but if you are driven to serve an audience and that audience wants cold storage for, that's just an emergency manager doing their job, flexing resources because we've got a disaster. Doesn't mean that it's going to get filled, but it is David Muir, and he's selling this fear, and it's just hard to swallow that. Or the other thing, Andy Ngo was banned from, and who cares about SoundCloud, but Andy Ngo was banned from SoundCloud because he's written a book about his reporting on Antifa and the odious actions that those people take towards him and towards society in general. And he gets banned for being, this is a reporter. Yeah. Like, gets silenced. How in the world, do we take that seriously?
Yeah. And that's, and I know that, there is the argument that, well, these are all private companies. They can censor whoever they want, yada, yada, this and that. And legally correct.
Yes.
Morally incorrect, and morally wrong. And that's, I can't remember the author's name, but I just read a great article about how it's not necessarily the rights of free speech that are under attack, but it's the culture of allowing free speech that we need to rebuild. The culture of allowing Socratic questioning, of allowing debate, of allowing rational critical reasoning and critical reading and writing of somebody else's work. And once we start saying that that's not necessary, that we need to give all that up, well, then we're done as a nation, and or we're done as a society. And that's, I can go back and give you several historical examples of societies that thought that they knew everything that there was needed to know, and they didn't need any outside influence, and therefore, this took place in the Middle East all through the Middle Ages. And the theory was that if it was not something from Islam, or if it wasn't from, coming from the Islamic people, then science and math, and they were at the top of the world at the, during the Crusades in terms of all these things that Western Europeans discovered, from nutrition to astronomy to mathematics, all these things that Western society gained from the Crusades and combining these different cultures. But then afterwards, there's a distinct pattern of closing that culture closed down to the West. It's like these guys can't offer us anything. And then in 1802 or 1801, Napoleon shows up with several ships of the line and cannons, and simply invades Egypt and takes the country over and the West had been dominant over the Middle East ever since. And it's just because the amount of rational thought and questioning that we went through with the Enlightenment advanced Western society in leaps and bounds. And now we're talking about let's shut that down because we don't want to hear from one side or another because they're just pig-headed. And the virus is a great example, across the board.
Yeah. Why is the virus a great example?
Just because of the amount of misinformation that came out, and not that kind of misinformation came out, but that how much we were constrained at challenging that misinformation. And that came from both, leadership in the Trump administration as well as leadership in the Biden administration, from a national standpoint. But then finding out now that I think our National Institute of Health were requested by the Chinese to get rid of any kind of information that suggested it came from their lab, and they did it for them. I mean, that's kind of the antithesis of academic thought on why are we supposed, why are we here to learn more and progress as a society? I mean, it gets really esoteric when you get into that area, but there's all kinds of different problems that we have to deal with, and we've never solved them.
I mean, there's a lot of conversations within that to have, because there's so much misinformation. I was watching before we started today. I watched a couple minutes of the briefing President Trump was getting from Texas et al. And talking about the border thing, and you could see the clear spin in there politically. Talking about extremely negatively about the Biden administration. Which in part is fair because it's their administration and everything else. But some of that stuff this is a systematic problem. You're blaming these guys. This is a long-term problem,
Right. Exactly. And that's, again, that's, the entire border argument is going to go back and forth and back and forth. I mean, I have some extremely strong views on, what should be done, but quite frankly, I'm glad I'm in a position where that is not my job for this particular piece. That's in my work. I try to, I work for American Military University. I try to remain as apolitical as possible, but I still have to take a very strong standpoint on the way information is shared and used, and the best place to combat misinformation is in the marketplace of other ideas. I've even seen an academic paper that talked about here's a solution to get rid of misinformation is we are going to use a technique called prebunking. So instead of debunking a story after it came out and arguing against it, what we want to do, and again, this is the whole problem of looking at misinformation as a virus. And there's lots of articles out there that it's a virus that infects people, and it's misinformation spreads from person to person. Fake news goes from one area to another because of your confirmation bias. You're going to spread Facebook stories that you believe in, but they're wrong, but who cares because it's what you like. So it's seen as an infection. And so prebunking is thrown out as an academic solution to inoculating somebody against misinformation, so that if you gave them a piece of truth and you built up that truth, and then when false information came in, they were more immune to that false information. That it sounds great in an academic sense, but the problem is, what if you're prebunking them with BS?
Yeah, right.
Again, it's another human in the equation that says, we're not going to give you the truth. We're going to give you our narrative first,
right,
and then expose you to. Well, guess what? That's called spin at that point. And the example that they use, and I'm going to, this is another third rail that nobody wants to touch is the one on climate change. And the study that the academics used was they pre-bunked their test subjects, their test audience, by showing them the report that 97% of scientists agreed that climate change was man-made.
Yeah.
Well, there are dozens and dozens of academic papers that have shown that that study was total, that 97% number is total BS, because it was taken from several researchers just combing through academic papers, and of anybody who mentioned climate change, 97% of them said it was human caused. Well, that doesn't take into account the 60% of the papers that didn't even talk about climate change that they went through. And so there's not, to be able to say that, whatever you can have whatever your opinion on whether climate change is man-made or not, but don't use that 97% argument, because it is demonstrably false. And yet this academic study used that to pre-bunk or to inoculate somebody against adverse information. And it's almost like I listened to Baghdad Bob, who is the head of the Ministry of Information for Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War. If I listened to every single thing he said and believed it, every other thing coming in that showed the U.S. forces just trouncing through Iraq in the second Gulf War, I would be in disbelief of it, because I've been pre-bunked by somebody who was telling me total lies the entire time. So again, it's another way of somebody saying, well, we got a solution to that. And it's like, look, if the solution does not include rational argument, logical thought, and critical thinking, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and if you can't have some rigor, if you've got a univariate solution to a multivariate problem, we've got it's like race. If you use race as a univariate solution to things, then you've missed out. Someone talked to me the other day about the black-white pay gap. Like, well, first off, what's black, what's white? And then, by the way, what's the average age of these groups? Because that's how you instantly start to close that gap. You're like, well, obviously people who are older have more experience, make more money. Okay, white people are older in this. Okay, so that shrinks and all of a sudden you've got this gap that's not based on race. It's based on a variety of factors, because that's just like, if we're going to do something about climate change, well, we can't seem to kill drugs off. We can't seem to get rid of poverty. We can't seem to, we have all these wars on things. What makes us think we're going to do any better? Another thing I wanted to touch on is, because we're about to see this in a couple of days, is it's just about 4th of July. We're going to see a bunch of postings of Frederick Douglass's speech from the 4th of July. And it's a classic example of this. Yeah. That is a 39-page speech. It takes about an hour to deliver.
Right.
You're going to see a 2-minute piece of that. And if you know anything about Frederick Douglass and how eloquent he is, he knows exactly what he's saying. He's making a larger point. And yes, there is a searing, hot, well-written, beautifully powerful piece where he talks about, the United States and the problem with race and slavery. However, there's a whole other section where he talks about the beauty of the United States. Right. And so that's a classic example of, we're about to all get inundated with bullshit. It's abridged. Right. James Earl Jones can perform it all he wants, perform the whole goddamn thing, Right.
Well, that's, if you think about 1860s, 1876, these community fairs, that they featured hour-long orators.
Right.
And in fact, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was 90 seconds, but it followed 3 hours of the previous speakers. Just, that was the entertainment. That's the podcast of the 19th century. So if you took every podcast you've ever done, everything you've ever said, took 2 minutes of that, they could have you swearing allegiance to Mao Zedong and telling everybody you're a pink turnip. I mean, it's, you could put something together that just makes any kind of wild argument that you want. I hate to say that, but there's an entire industry that excels at doing that right now.
Yeah. And they create that influence, which is ultimately circling us back to where we start, is psychological operations, information operations, and trying to create the affect. I always talk about affect over effect, the affect that you want, because you can put out a bunch of BS messages. If no one cares or believes you, then you're losing your affect battle. Right. Can we talk a little bit about cold cases? I know you're under some counter constraints and everything, but let's talk about what you've been working on and what's progressing.
Well, there's 4 major cold cases that we've been working on. In fact, the one for DB Cooper, we've been working on that one for what year is it? 10 years. We've been working that. Or at least I've been involved with that one. And actually, Tom Colbert, who we had on last year sometime. That one is now filming for a premium streaming service that will come out in February. Can't tell you who it is or which streaming service it is, but obviously it's a big one. That one is going great, and I think that's you'll get done with that one, and you'll get to the point where, look, if the guy that we've identified didn't do it, O.J. Simpson did it, because we have so much information on this guy, what he's done, and everything else. The other ones, we've finally made the announcement that we're actually working them, and there's a website that Tom Colbert and his wife Donna have put up. It's called thecasebreakers.org. And it basically announced, it started a couple of weeks ago, but we are working on the Zodiac case. We are working the Jimmy Hoffa case, and we are also working a branch or a portion of the Atlanta child murders of 1979, 1980. And in each of these cases, including the Cooper case, we think we've gotten to the solution of them because we've tried a totally different approach to each of them, and that's reverse engineering one of the hypotheses from using a tip-off or a spark in the investigation. I think a lot of the folks who do cold case investigations, one of the reasons why they get frustrated and never solve these is because they approach the investigation of that case in the same manner. They look at, all right, here's all the things that happened up until the crime was committed. And now after the crime was committed, it branches off into all these different theories of who did it. Now let's just investigate each of them. But they're doing it almost in a sequential order so that they run into the same dead ends that folks ran into decades earlier. What we've had in each of these cases, we've had somebody approach us and say, I think I know who this person is. And they've given us some key piece of physical evidence or testimony that says this is the guy. And from that point, all the other hypotheses, you instead of them all the different hypotheses competing with each other, you just take the one that you had that piece and you reverse engineer the investigation. It says, let's trace this then back. Is this the guy that did it? And in 3 of these cases, we think we found the solution. In the one of them, the one for the Atlanta child's murder, that one has gone so far off the rails of where we thought it was going to be. So we just disproved our own initial hypothesis that we are now in a totally new area, and it's involving a whole set of new folks that we needed to research and talk to and look at. That was really going to turn some heads and turn some ears as soon as we can come out with that. The other cases are, again, the Zodiac and the Hoffa case. Those are essentially your holy grail cases your holy grails of cold cases. And there's entire society set up to putting those pieces together. And there's lots of theories left and right. Some of those, like the Zodiac case, we think we are on the cusp of actually solving this one. The Hoffa case, less so, because until somebody sees physical evidence of, there he is, it'll never be solved. So for that particular one, we're working off of a tip-off. It's in a completely different direction than anybody else has ever gone in, because the tip-off told us to start in another direction. But if we are able to find physical evidence and corroborate it with the physical evidence we've already received, then we'll have solved that one. But that one's, if I got to be really skeptical about any of them, that's what I'm retaining my skepticism on more than anything else.
The interesting thing about all of this, if you watch 2020 or any of these shows that profile cases, we often see when the police get fixated on a topic, on a subject. I'm very close to a murder case. I think we talked about it, the one where it's triple jeopardy. They try the guy. It turns into a mistrial. He try him. He's innocent. And then the army pulls him back in and tries him again. Right. And now he's still in jail. And there's essentially no real evidence. But once he became the guy, actually, there is evidence. There's DNA evidence under the fingernails of one of the victims. And the military will not test it to potentially exonerate or confirm. And actually, I think there's something like they know it can't be his DNA or something like that, but they won't try to determine whose it is. Gotcha. So these things are crazy. So you see this all the time where someone's exonerated, but like we still got our eye on this guy because we still think he's somehow involved. And so they look, and I wouldn't be any different. It's really hard. You need to have this less passionate. You're not fighting for a victim, you're fighting for the truth, I think, is my assumption, and why you guys are able to take a new turn and follow the evidence where it leads you, and then back out and approach it from another angle again if it needs to be.
Right. And part of what we're doing, besides taking a new analytical approach to it, is we now also have two new tools at our disposal, or capabilities, and one of them is the crowdsourcing aspect. And so for these different cases, there is a lot of subject matter experts that we've pulled in for all of them. We're talking to anthropologists, we're talking to code breakers from the Vietnam era, we're talking to just all kinds of different subject matter experts, even geospatial experts. I got a gal who's helping me in North Carolina, fantastic recent college grad, a different generation of analysts, but she's going to look at things much differently than you or I ever would. Yeah. Right. And so that's the first piece, is the crowdsourcing. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a series on Netflix called Don't F with Cats.
Oh yeah. I watched that whole thing. Fascinating. Yeah.
That's a prime example of how crowdsourcing can work. But again, crowdsourcing is like bringing together 1,000 cats into the room and figuring out, all right, now figure out how to pick this lock. You really gotta, and you can show, and even though it's just a horrible, disturbing case, through and through. But I was looking at it from a cold case, investigator standpoint, where you had all these folks who wanted to help. You had dozens of folks online that essentially were cheerleading the effort to go find this guy worldwide. And some of them were finding bits and pieces of information, but when you really got down to it, it was only a core team of 2 or 3 folks that you had to have. They essentially became the case managers. And without that kind of management and leadership that they just picked up impromptu on them, on their own, they never would have identified some of the key pieces into catching this guy. And that's, so I look at it as, you can look at it as like, oh, this is just a horrible thing. It's going to keep me up at night. And here's me, I'm looking at it from a, critical standpoint. It's like, well, how do they manage this? Or what was the communications like on that? So I'm looking at it, I hate to say it, from a lessons learned standpoint than anything else. That's a great way of, the first piece. And the second piece that we have is we now have data mining tools that can sift through some of this old information and look at it in a different way. Yeah. And an example is, one of the locations, geographic locations, we think one of these crimes occurred. We have photos from 20, 30 years ago around when the crime occurred, but then we're superimposing that imagery over what that looks like today from an overhead imagery shot. And it tells us a totally different story of what we initially thought in the first place. Like, well, wait a minute, things by looking at that, things are now completely changed, and now we got to look at this crime in a wholly different manner, because we now have the tools to physically look at the environment and how it's changed over the decades.
I suppose there's also the aspect of, I watched that David Berkowitz, a Netflix special, and there's powerful stuff in that, where if the institution does not want to allow a certain outcome to happen, whether it was legitimate or not, you've got this problem of something. There's a greater good for the in this case the police union or whatever it's going to be. Right. I don't know if David Berkowitz acted alone or in tandem with other people, but there's a whole lot of doubt according to that and documentary slanted its own way. But these things definitely have a lot of players in them that want a certain outcome. We're not done with this Derek Chauvin case. We're not done with it. Right. It's going to continue to come back, and
it will appeal for years,
as we've seen with the Bill Cosby case today. The more you fuck with the case, the more you try to influence it outside of the jury box, and outside of the courtroom, the more jeopardized that conviction is going to be. I'm curious because I come from Benicia. One of the murders happened on Lake Herman Road, which is Benicia, and then right around the corner from that, about a mile away, is Blue Rock Springs, the golf course where I played golf on. I know that parking lot where those kids were killed. Yeah. So I know these cases. Blake Berryess is a place where we all went to. So I'm really knowledgeable in this thing. Kleinsmith did a lot of work, but he's first mover. And so he had the interesting benefit of going, look, Napa, Vallejo, San Francisco, none of you guys talk. I'm able to put these things together, but only because you barely let me do it. Nowadays, you guys are able to really get after this. One of the confounding things is every time they think they've got, like it's cinched, it's going to be this guy. It's never that guy, and there's some kind of fatal flaw. And again,
Right.
we don't want to give up Arthur Allen Lee because we're like, no, it has to be him, but it's not him, you know?
Right. I mean, that's, again, you might have the communications pipelines or technology has opened those up, but you're never going to get around the parochialism of different departments wanting to protect their own or somebody who has their theory. They've sold, there's folks who, they've sold books on these crimes. They've posited, this is my theory. And anything that comes out of it is like, man, I don't want my theory to get washed. I'm still trying to sell books, on this that says something else, so that's one of the issues. We're trying to keep things as close knit within a very small group as possible. Again, the great thing about what Tom Colbert is trying to do is, these cases are just, at this point, they're historical in nature. I mean, 50 years old or around that time.
Right.
But, we have hundreds and thousands of cases that are unsolved every year. Yet we have an entire, industry of folks in the private sector who just like to do investigative work, to retired police investigators, FBI agents, investigative reporters. It's like they may be retired, but they're still interested in doing this work. There is no apparatus that can bring these folks together and herd all these cats to be able to solve. There could be a cold case group in every single state. That's one of the things that we're trying to do on the side with my university is to create a fraternity for cold case work, because the average age of our student is 32, and a lot of these guys are investigators. Right. Besides being our students, and so what a great way to do some work with them. One of our, I think I brought on Jennifer Buchholz when she came out. She's on her next case as a private investigator. Working this, and she's besides being on our cold case team, especially on the Zodiac case, we just talked yesterday and just going through the pros and cons of crowdsourcing and how difficult that can be if there's no controls in place.
Yeah. Well, and that Zodiac killer site is a treasure trove of information, and you can go through and dig through that stuff. But you're going to get they all have their guy. They all have their guy,
Well, and we're finding in these cases that every one of them that we've got has not been somebody on the radar. And you can't just solve a case by doing research on the internet and say, I think I got it. Each one of these cases has required old-fashioned gumshoe. We've even brought some flowers to a woman and that's related to the Hoffa case, because her husband was involved so many years ago, and so we're trying to get his old letters on what he might know. And so there's, that takes, you just can't go on a Google search and say, I can find this information out. Yeah. You got to go talk to that person. You got to get their permission. You got to dissuade them from any problems that might be caused or their fear of repercussion or anything like that. In every case that we're dealing with, there's not a single person that's still alive that's directly involved with it. Except for the Atlanta child murders, I take it back because Williams is still in jail.
Still in jail, yeah. Either of the Kennedy killings, either of those solvable? They both have so much doubt to this day.
I think those have been, and you get into the point where some of these cases had layers and layers and layers of misinformation laid over them. I don't think you're in Hoffa is the same thing. It's like we may never find the truth. And I want to say it's like some of these cases have just become Al Capone's vault at this point. It's like it's we'll know the answer when God tells us, and for all of us, that's not going to be until the next life. Right. What else do you want to cover? You want to ask me anything? No, I'm good. I mean, I usually give, I do webinars on a regular basis. I have one I'm going to be doing for our schools fairly soon on misinformation and censorship, but it's all, plugging away, doing what I do every day anyway. So hopefully, I just wish I could tell you more about these cases, but I'm just so excited to talk about some of these that go on forever. I know. Well, we'll get to it when you guys are able to talk about it. I'm excited to talk about it, especially Zodiac, because I've just spent, look, as kids, when we drove in that road, we could terrify ourselves on Lake Herman Road.
that the Zodiac killer was out there. It was a threat. Every Halloween that something would happen, you would see this symbol painted everywhere because it's part of my upbringing. So I'm excited about it. All right, well then, let's wrap this up. We'll have you on as soon as you got something to report. Bring Tom on, whoever it is, and just again, it's always so much fun to have you on and to be able to hang like this. It's great.
If we have something, I may be able to come out there and do it live with you. How's that?
Perfect. I have a tent. I have a couch. I have everything we need.
All right, very cool.
Stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much for watching.